What do you say?
Hello everyone, it's Saltyman here again. Okay, so today we're going to be going over the various debuffs and disables in Xenoblade Chronicles X. So, some of these debuffs are actually more straightforward, but obviously this game is never that easy, so things do get more complicated later in the game. So we also will be talking about these debuff tiers and debuff resistance. Now, debuffs are pretty interesting in this game actually. Depending on how you play, they can have a huge impact on your playstyle. So we will go over most of the debuffs first. Now, this one is Topple, but we'll actually talk about Stagger first. Now, there's not too many melee arts with Stagger, but if you use the Javelin or the Longsword, it can actually play a big part. Now, this does work a bit different in Xenoblade Chronicles X. It does stun the opponent for a short time, and it makes them easier to topple, but you don't need it to topple an enemy. So, it is okay on a, or is so disable on its own, but the main use of it is actually for setting up bind with skills. So, if you have had skills yet, you may notice sometimes you can actually bind enemies and hold them for an extended period of time. So this is great because not only does it disable them, but you actually regain fuel on your skill. So that can be quite useful if you have skills, but that is more common on skilled weapons as well. It's not too common on arts, but it does help. Now, Topple works even without Stagger, but it does make enemies a bit easier to topple, but you generally don't need it in this game. So Topple will just disable an enemy completely, so it just knocks them down completely, and you can see Topple 5, it has a 6-second duration. So for most of the disables, actually the tiers are a bit more obvious. So you can actually get Topple 6, which I'm assuming is just slightly longer. That's generally how the disables work with their tiers. It actually doesn't affect resistance, we'll talk about that later. So you can see this one does have immediate reuse as well, so one very viable strategy in this game is Topple Locking, which is basically toppling them repeatedly, because most of these debuffs and disables, you can actually use them repeatedly, like it will just reset every time, but there is a few exceptions, which we'll get to later. So you can also see this one's done. This is similar to Topple. It doesn't knock enemies over, but it does disable them for a extended period of time. But it generally is a little shorter because they don't have to go through the standing animation after getting knocked out. Now, there's a few interesting cases where you actually need to have a disable on to get damage bonuses, like you can see with Flame Grenade. You do need to have enemies toppled. But it also works the same way with some effects and skills, so we'll check those out later. Now, Sleep is one of those odd cases. Sleep does not stack with Topple. If you use Topple, it will break Sleep no matter what, and you cannot put an enemy that's toppled to sleep. So, generally, if an enemy with sleep is hit, it will wake up, but there is some skills and effects that prevent this from happening. So if everyone on your squad has these skills and effects, that means the enemy basically won't wake up even when being attacked. So this can be used for different builds, but it does take quite a few skills to support it. But the other way it can be used is just to disable groups of enemies while you're targeting single ones, or to disable enemies and run away, because you can see this does last much longer than most disables, but obviously can break it easily. So this can be used, but it does require a lot to support it. Okay, so you can see Decoy Round inflicts Taunt, but one interesting thing is some of these debuffs actually inflict Flinch as well. So Flinch disables enemies for a short period of time, but the arts that inflict it are normally very spammable. So Taunt actually forces the enemy to target the character who used Taunt. So if you use it, the enemy's forced to target you, but you can have this on your squad mates as well, and then they'll always target your squad mates. So this one can actually be quite useful, But you can also see this one with morale, it boosts TP, so every time you get those reaction commands in combat, that gives you 1 morale. So when you get quite a few of those, this will give you a ton of tension points in combat. And another thing is during overdrive, any of these purple arts, the debuffs, it won't work on debuffs on arts for attacks, but these purple ones will actually give you extra tension points. So skills like this, the Flinched, can be used to disable enemies while building overdrive and tension points, so it actually can be quite useful. It also does interrupt action, so with good timing it can be used as a short disable anyways. Now Flash Grenade also deals Flinch, and it inflicts Blackout. So Blackout reduces enemies' accuracy, evasion, and range damage, so this is quite good, but on its own is not going to do as much. You're going to actually need some evasion or accuracy to really support it. But the reduction to range damage is always great, and this also inflicts Flinch, but you can see this actually deals electric damage. So one thing is debuffs generally can be reflected, but you can see Decoy Round and Screamer attribute is none. It doesn't actually inflict any damage. So these cannot be reflected. These can be resisted, or the enemy can be immune, which we'll talk to later. But they can't actually be reflected. So this can cause some issues, especially on the assault rifle. As you can see, this is attribute electric, and it deals 2 disables. And then you have some physical disables. And then your main attacks are thermal. So if you have enemies actually reflecting, you not only have to recover a lot of different reflection types to negate, but you also have a lot of disables you can potentially hit yourself with. So in situations like that, you're probably going to want to find a weapon that's less heavy on the debuffs, or just opt not to use all of these. There is one aura that negates all reflection types, but it's not always the best choice. So you will want to be aware of if your debuffs actually deal damage and what attribute type it is. Because if they're all one type, normally you can just use the negate reflect augment, but if they're all over the place, it can be quite a problem. So we will go into some of these other debuffs now, but one thing is debuffs are probably the best way to go on your squad, so oops, sorry. I do have quite a few of my squad mates as well we can go over quickly here. So this, again, you can see inflicts Blackout, but this has a huge area of effect and hits 3 times. And you can also see it has the secondary and tertiary cooldown bonus. So this has a few advantages. Is it can actually potentially inflict Blackout 5 in a huge area for 45 seconds. So it's obviously quite a powerful effect. And also, the way that debuffs work in overdrive is it's actually based on the amount of hits. So debuffs with a lot of hits will give you a lot of tension points, and debuffs with an area of effect will give you even more. So Myopic Screen can actually give you like 10,000 TP or more instantly in overdrive. It's pretty crazy. Now, Virus is one of the less useful debuffs, but it is quite amusing to use. Now basically, when you use this, enemies can't use ranged attacks or arts, but pretty much every enemy you can hit this with has melee arts and attacks. So anything that kind of focuses on ranged attack or is actually out of range of you the entire time, you probably can't hit with Virus, but this can be amusing to use in some situations of watch enemies run around, or if they have certain ranged arts that are really affecting you, this can actually be useful in some situations, but it's normally not worth the art slot. So you can see this one actually inflicts Debuff Resist Down, so this is fairly obvious. It just reduces debuff resistance, but the way debuff resistance works in this game is a bit odd. So most enemies who are resistant to other debuffs are actually resistant to this anyways, and Debuff Resistance actually works more like evasion in this game, if that makes sense. Like, just because they're resisting a debuff doesn't mean they'll resist it every single time. So that can make this handy in some situations because it actually hits 3 times, meaning you'll have a higher chance of hitting this. This also works with arts like Myopic Screen. So it can be good and bad, but I haven't found too many situations where this actually helps me land other debuffs reliably. It's normally just like an extra debuff for TP or for Blackbait. Now, some arts also have some hidden debuffs or disable. So Beam Bomber and Grenade Blitz actually inflict launch, but that only works on small enemies and is more amusing than anything else because they have really high damage scaling. But one other interesting case is Galactic Cataclysm on the Photon Sabers, which actually inflicts knockdown. So some of those giant enemies you can actually send flying with that thing. It does seem also with knockdown, the bigger the enemy, the longer it takes for them to get back up, if that makes sense. And that also is an area of effect, so if enemies are in front of you, you can actually send them all flying. So some of those things can be pretty situationally great. See if there's any I haven't covered here. Okay, here's another interesting one. This is unique to the knife, but some of you may know about this, but you can seize control of targeted enemies. Now, this will work on most standard enemies on the game. It will not work on tyrants at all. So, it's extra of limited effectiveness. I did not really test this on any story mission enemies though, so I'm not sure how it will fare on those. The thing that goes with it is Servant Sacrifice. So, this can either buff the target that's controlled, which makes it a more effective teammate, I guess, but it can also instantly kill them, which at lower levels can be good for taking out like enemies with tons of health, but later in the game it's definitely not a viable route at all, since most of the enemies you'll actually want to be killing are completely immune to both of them. I think that's all the ones my teammates have, but we will go through and make sure we get all of them. Now, Infuriate is like a crappy version of Decoy Round, but it also inflicts Flinch, so you can actually spam them together in Overdrive to just flinch lock enemies while building TP, so you can do a few interesting things like that with it. Now, if it will let me move over. I also believe there's one debuff for every Elemental Resistance down. So you can see here's one inflict physical resist down. So yeah, I think there's one for every single one. This one's really good actually because it has an area of effect. So this not only works with the taunt, but it also works with the secondary effect. So if, say if you have 1 morale and you have this max level and there's 5 enemies around them, this will give you massive TP even outside of Overdrive. So that can be pretty good. Or you can just give it to one of your squad mates and then everyone will just kill them instead of you. Now slow arts actually reduces the cooldown on enemies' arts and auto attacks. So their arts kind of work the same way as you. They have cooldowns, but I do not believe they have any secondary, tertiary cooldown things or anything like that. I know some of their arts and skills actually change as fights progress, but yeah, I do know they do have set cooldowns on certain arts, so that actually does make them use them slower. Now, fatigue is kind of useless actually. It reduces melee damage, so The problem with this is most melee attacks are pretty strong anyways, so there's not too many situations where it keeps you alive, but if you equipped it to a squad mate, it's always good to have, since there is quite a few skills that, or quite a few arts that have that, sorry. Like I know Elma has this, and you pretty much need to use Elma, so that can help. Now you can see some of these are kind of interesting though. Some attack arts are more debuffs, but then this one's a debuff, but it actually does a ton of damage. This also hits 3 times really quick, so this is a really good attack on its own, but this is also the main source of gaining TP on the Javelin. So yeah, in Overdrive you can actually use debuffs primarily to build tension points. Okay, covered them all. But yeah, basically for the disables, the tier actually just raises the duration of the effect. But most of the cards, it will actually tell you how long it lasts. Most of the resistance down, or elemental resistance down, it will be the same as the buff. So say level 1 will be like 10, level 5 will be 50. Most of the other ones will work this way. But some of the debuffs will also level up their other effects when you're leveling up the art. So inflict art, or slow arts, I would assume is like a percentage. So say it would reduce their cooldown by 10%, tier 5 it would be 50%. Now these also do seem to follow more of the rules of the buffs, is that single target ones will generally go up to level 5, and then area of effect ones will go to tier 3. So they might still have the plus buff tiers as secondary or tertiary effects, and there's a few other ways you can increase that, which we'll talk about in a moment. Just wanted to make sure we covered all those. Now, one interesting thing about the debuffs though is you do have debuff resistance, but you do have a lot of skills and effects that actually affect the debuffs. So you can see this is one of your main sources, not the skill necessarily, but this effect. So this actually reduces their overall debuff resistance to everything when you're hitting them with anything, but this is kind of misleading. It basically just reduces their debuff resistance. You don't necessarily always need to hit them first before it takes effect. So there's some skills as well that increase your debuff resistances. Now you can see this one actually resists or increases a few specific ones. So most augments will work this way, but there's some skills that will increase all of your resistances, and then this increases quite a few useful ones. Although those 3 are quite rare, but when you do need it, that 100 bonus is quite useful. Now these 2 actually go with sleep. So you can see there's one of the skills for arts and one for auto attacks. So if you have both of those equipped, basically what that means is enemies will never wake up if you're attacking them. But that also means that your squad mates have to have the equivalent effects, or they will wake the enemy up. Now, one reason not only sleep lasts a really long time is you get certain effects for debuffs. So you can see this one boosts damage to sleeping enemies by 150%. So that is quite useful. There also is a skill that increases sleep duration. But you can see this one as well, boost damage to taunted enemies. So that's another reason you might actually want to use taunt, is that skill is quite useful. This is a rather unique skill. This reduces specific resistance to topple. and then this increases topple duration, and then this boosts melee art damage by 100% damage to enemies inflicted with topple. So there's quite a few to support some of these various debuffs, so you actually can build around them. Same as Blackout, that's a skill you kind of want to build around. Obviously, if you have extremely high evasion and decent accuracy, if you hit someone with tier 5 or tier 6 Blackout, they're pretty much useless against you, because they actually have to hit you to land debuffs. But same as other enemies, you have to hit them to land the debuff. Now, I did mention before, you can actually have debuffs reflected, but there is a way around this. You can see here I have my Nullify Thermal Reflect. So this will actually negate everything, and then I can actually still hit them with my Blaze, for example, on Quick Cannon. But as I mentioned before, the Assault Rifle, you won't actually be able to hit them with Assault Rifle or Flash Grenade or any of that good stuff. So it can be an issue. There also is some augments that increase the effect of specific arts, or specific debuffs, sorry. So there's, I think, Blaze, or there's quite a few, but the main ones are Blaze, Shock, and Blackout. I think Blackout might go on armors. Here we go. No. Also, firing range up actually works on most ranged debuffs. There's a few odd cases though, like Decoy Round actually has a set range for some reason. So it can vary, but most of the ranged ones, it will increase the range. So that can also be quite useful for landing certain debuffs at range. You also do have a few interesting augments that give you a chance of inflicting debuffs while auto-attacking, but honestly you should give these to your squad mates, not use them on yourself, because you don't want to be using your melee auto-attacks. Like, that's just leaving yourself open to get killed. So yeah, those are kind of questionable on yourself, but they can be interesting to use on squad mates. I have some more of these. So yeah, there is quite a few for different debuffs. Now, this is your main source of reducing debuff resistance. So you can see this is the same as that skill, but you can get these augments up to 50%. So certain enemies will have debuff resistance, and the way this works is it will be a certain number, and you have to reduce that to a number where you can actually hit. So this kind of works the same as evasion in this game. So say an enemy has 300 debuff resistance, and you have base 100 debuff accuracy, for example. You actually have to reduce it by 200 to hit them reliably, but you'll have to reduce it by even more than that to hit them every single time. And if you reduce it by, say, 275, so they have 125 debuff resistance, you'll be missing them most of the time. So if it's a bit over, you'll miss them most of the time. If it's a bit under, you'll miss them most of the time. But if it's way too high, you'll miss every time. If it's way too low, you'll hit every time. So I'm assuming most enemies have a base resistance of 0, because most standard enemies in the game you can actually hit with every debuff reliably. So I'm not actually sure how those numbers work, but I wanted to explain how the hits actually work, because just because you're not hitting every time doesn't mean you can't hit them. So that's where some debuffs such as Blackout or Debuff Resist Down can actually come into play, since you have some multi-hit debuffs. So those are most of the actual effects that affect your debuffs. But another way to increase your tiers is through soul voices. So you have quite a few of these you can turn on, and this is also tied to those reaction commands. When you get certain effects, like these requirements listed here, and then you get the reaction command, the next debuff used, or whatever these are, will get the bonus effect mentioned. So there's quite a few of these. You can see these actually increase your debuff tiers and bypass debuff resistances. So that means if they were resisting it, you'll hit them at no matter what. But if they're immune or reflecting it, it still won't hit them. So there's quite a few +1 debuff tiers. There's one over here at +2. But there's also a few soul voices that actually work when you land a disable or debuff. So you can see this one is extremely powerful. If you land Topple on an enemy, you can get up to 400% damage bonus on melee attacks. So some of these can actually be quite powerful. That's another thing you'll want to be mindful of, is not only the debuffs your squad mates have, but how their skills and their soul voices affect these debuffs. So you can see Mia doesn't actually have anything for debuffs, but she's kind of like half buffs and half debuffs, so that's okay. I'm not sure why Hope doesn't have anything for debuffs. Like, it's kind of odd now that I'm looking through. Most of the characters with the best debuffs do not have soul voices for debuffs, so yeah. Same as buffs. Generally, you just want to level them up or rely on your secondary or tertiary cooldown for higher tiers. You don't always want to rely on your teammates, because not all of them have soul voices for debuffs. And your own can be a bit unreliable, so we will try to go test out these debuffs in action here. Actually, let's make myself a bit less useless. Okay, good enough. Let's do this. We'll just kill this guy quick, then wrap up. Have all the debuffs on my squad. Where did he go? Oh, he jumps out a lot farther than he actually spawns. You can see the red dot there. It can be easy to run into him by accident. Oh no, I'm dying. Why is no one helping? There we go. Just need those assault hammers.
Flash grenade! Decoy round! You ready? Here I come! Decoy round! You ready? Here I come!
I can't do anything, man.
Decoy round! Assault hammer! Assault breaker! Assault breaker!
Oh, where is his back? He's just like a circle. This is why it's hard to use some of these positional targeting things sometimes, actually. If it's front, it's okay because enemies like to face you, but sometimes it's like, where's their side or back? There we go. But yeah, you can see you just have like infinite TP once you have overdrive built up. So, anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video and learned something about the debuffs. We'll be back next time with auras and start discussing how to actually build a character next time. So, thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.
Amazing!